Jonathan Lee Riches Investigates. I am covering the Moscow, Idaho Bryan Kohberger case. In April of 2018, Bryan Kohberger sat front row at a lecture held by Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale. This was at Northampton Community College. The image has been circulating all over the internet with Bryan Kohberger sitting front row. Now, people wanted to know, what was that lecture all about? Well, I'm going to show you right now. I got the full lecture right here. I'm going to share in its entirety. You can see and listen to what Margaret Atwood said at Northampton Community College, April of 2018. I'm going to share this entire lecture. This is for educational purposes only. I was able to obtain the lecture. Bryan Kohberger sat front row and listened to Margaret Atwood. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm going to share it right here, and I'm looking forward to reading your comments on your thoughts about this lecture. Check it out.
Well, good evening and welcome. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mark Erickson. I'm the lucky guy that's the president of Northampton Community College. Welcome to our 7th annual Humanities Endowed Lecture. Prior speakers for this event have included Doris Kearns-Goodwin, Michael Beschloss, Wes Moore, Will Allen, Colin McCann, and Bill McKibbins. And this evening, we are incredibly thrilled to welcome Margaret Atwood. For what promises to be not only a timely, but a very thought-provoking evening. You know, Northampton's annual Humanities Endowed Lecture Series was funded through seed money through the National Endowment for the Humanities that was then matched by a lot of local funders who are actually here tonight. So how about a big round of applause for them? This event annually allows our students to engage with and learn from incredibly interesting speakers from all around the world, and we're blessed again tonight with that. It also gives the opportunity for the public here in this community, free of charge, to come to incredible events like this. But it doesn't happen without a lot of hard work. So thank yous go out, first of all, to Dr. Elizabeth Bugaigas, Dean of Education and Academic Success, for pulling all this together. To Carolyn Clifford and our IA staff who put together the event planning. You will hear later from one of our students, Melanie Kelleher, who will be introducing our speaker. How fantastic is that? And then, of course, I would like to welcome to the stage Professor Kara McClintock Walsh, who was part of a faculty group that developed the theme for this year, Exploring Identity Through the Humanities, and she will introduce our student. So, Kara, you're on.
Hello and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the keynote speech delivered by world-renowned novelist Margaret Atwood. I hope you are as excited as I am this evening, which would mean that you would be beside yourself with excitement. I'm Dr. Kara McClintock Walsh. I'm an English professor here at Northampton Community College, and it is my privilege to be one of this year's faculty co-chairs of a generous National Endowment for the Humanities grant. This grant allows us to offer a full year of cultural programming around a different theme, and this year our theme is Exploring Identity Through the Humanities. We're living in a moment when the humanities are little understood. What are they exactly? And what is the value of this seemingly nebulous field of study? The American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission defines both the field and its real and timeless value. The humanities, including the study of languages, literature, history, philosophy, religion, ethics, and the arts, are disciplines of memory and imagination, telling us where we have been and helping us to envision where we are going. This year has been full of events, readings, and excursions that have actively highlighted the power of the humanities to clarify our past, but also to connect our past to our present moment. Some of these events included a lecture that illustrated the ways in which archaeology allows figures from the past to speak to the present, field trips to the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Tenement Museum that allowed our students to learn about history through rich, vital, and long-neglected narratives, nature walks in Penn's Woods that connected students with the world around them and with the writers who were inspired by the natural world, panel discussions that examine the ways in which literature can have a direct impact on history and policy, and a lot of events that introduce students to the works of Margaret Atwood, from professor-led book discussions to a screening of the documentary Payback, Debt and the Shadow Side of Wealth. This film was based on a series of essays Margaret Atwood wrote, examining the idea of what it means for someone to have a debt to society that cannot be paid back through money. Our honors, ethics, and moral problem students led a discussion of the film and Ms. Atwood's essays, and then they partnered with an art class who in turn created works of art inspired by her essays, and those were hanging in the lobby as you came in, so make sure to get a look at them on the way out. And tonight, of course, is our culminating event in our year-long exploration of identity and the humanities, a keynote address by an author who has spent nearly 5 decades interrogating the idea of identity, individual, cultural, national, in her poetry, novels, and prose. When I first learned that Margaret Atwood would be coming here to Northampton, I was on vacation with my family in Cape Cod. And I did 2 things when Dr. Bougakis gave me the great news. I immediately told anyone within earshot that I was going to get to meet Margaret Atwood. And I raced down to the bookstore to immediately buy one of her novels. And it was actually this one. I brought my own props, Handmaid, in which Margaret Atwood reimagines Shakespeare's The Tempest in a contemporary setting, in a prison, in fact, and through the eyes of a teacher who teaches Shakespeare to inmates. And although I hope my students never think of my classroom as a prison, as someone who teaches Shakespeare on a regular basis, I admired the ways in which she reconceived this most canonical of texts in the least canonical of settings and brought something new and vital to a story hundreds of years old. So as I purchased my copy of Handmaid, I could not help but tell the bookseller, so Margaret Atwood is going to be giving a lecture at my school in the spring. The bookseller's response was immediate. Margaret Atwood? Oh my God, where is your school and how can I get tickets? When I explained to her that Northampton Community College was the Pennsylvania Northampton and not the much, much closer to her Massachusetts Northampton, she remained undeterred. Distance did not matter. She asked again, where is your school and how can I get tickets? There are a million things that make Margaret Atwood exceptional as a writer, and the next speaker might not outline all million of them, but we'll tell you of some of them. But for me, when I think back on my own experience with her novels, one of the things that makes her unusual is the urgency people feel about her work. All throughout my life, when someone has recommended a Margaret Atwood novel to me, it's never been casually, like, oh, you might like this book. My life as a reader has been punctuated with moments where someone pushed a Margaret Atwood novel into my hands and said, you must read this book. When I was an undergraduate spending way too much time in coffee houses, the owner of my favorite coffee house one day approached me with this very copy of The Robber Bride and pushed it in my hands and said, you must read this. And this, I think, is still her copy, and that was more than 20 years ago. And when I was in graduate school struggling to write a dissertation, one of my advisors tipped this book off of her bookshelf, surfacing, and said, you must read this. What each person seemed to say to me in recommending one of Margaret Atwood's novels was not only that they had found something bright and right and powerful in them, but that these novels imparted a new understanding to them of the world, of identity, of humanity, and they felt the need in turn to share this new understanding with me. It was reading as an act of awakening and recommending as an act of love. This is the reason that Margaret Atwood is an ideal speaker for our event tonight. She embodies, perhaps more than any other author I know, the definition of the humanities that we started with. Her novels are disciplines of memory and imagination, telling us where we have been and helping us to envision where we are going. Her novels, like the humanities, illuminate our past, but hold up that light to show what shadows could darken our future. Now that I'm an English professor, I get to force students to read novels all the time. This past fall, I taught Intro to Women's Studies for the first time, and though most of my syllabus was a work in progress, one text I knew I had to teach was The Handmaid's Tale. It was my turn. I got to stand in front of a class of 24 students and say, "You have to read this." One of the students in that class was Melanie Kelleher, who distinguished herself throughout the semester, but who showed a particular sensitivity to The Handmaid's Tale. Every Monday and Wednesday morning when I walked into class, I would see her looking back at me, clutching the novel with a sense of horror on her face. Usually this is not what you want to see when you walk into your classroom, but considering we were reading this novel in 2017 in America, that look of horror showed she was paying attention. I am truly honored to introduce Melanie Kelleher, an honors student, a fine arts major, and a student as intellectually engaged as any I have taught during my 13 years here. She makes my job a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome. It is an honor to introduce one of the most influential writers of the 20th and 21st century, Margaret Atwood. The renowned author has won many international literary awards, including the prestigious Booker Prize, the PEN/Pinter Prize, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Atwood has written over 50 volumes of poetry, children's literature, fiction, and nonfiction. She is perhaps best known for her novels, which include The Edible Woman, The Handmaid's Tale, The Robber Bride, and The Blind Assassin. Published in over 40 languages, including Farsi, not only are her novels widely read, but they have also been adapted with great acclaim into several television series. You can find the adaptation of Atwood's Alias Grace on Netflix, and anticipate the adaptation of Mad Adam on HBO by celebrated filmmaker Darren Aronofsky. In 2017, the Hulu adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale received 8 Primetime Emmy Awards. Amazon data also shows that it was the most read book of 2017. I was one of those data points, reading her book last fall with Professor McClintock Walsh's Women and Gender Studies class. No book can disturb me quite like it. As fake news, cyber hacking, and bots were growing, while local newspapers in major cities were being shut down or bought out by billionaires, I needed something to contextualize the alarming and rapidly changing chaos. The eerie overlap of Atwood's fiction with articles from the daily paper definitely sped up the learning process. All offered the main character had left of the humanities were her college memories. Reading how her books opened face down this way and that, casually turned into an extravagance, terrified my soul. Offred's extravagance became my priority. As a student of the fine arts, my books are now always face up and close by when I'm drawing. My love of Atwood's writing wasn't always terrifying. It started with the Penelope ad. It is a retelling of the Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope and the maids. The book opens up the idea that multiple versions of stories exist, even epics. One of the book's major themes is to ask who gets to speak and why. Asking this question has become a life raft of mine amid the vast sea of misinformation. Offred's story and the Maid's Chorus are only 2 small examples of what art can do and why the humanities matter. It is both a privilege and a pleasure to introduce the writer whose art has brought us all here, Margaret Atwood.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. So here we are. I'm going to tell you my favorite Margaret Atwood story. About 15 years ago, we were giving a party in our house for a bunch of local writers. And one of them, a young woman of about 35, said that she was having a heart attack. She'd had a heart attack before, so this was serious business. So we took her into the living room and laid her out on the sofa, and Graham did deep breathing with her, and I called 911. It turned out she wasn't having a heart attack. She was having a ball of gas as big as a grapefruit, but it was being in my house. But we didn't know that yet. So along came two large paramedics, and they came up the steps with their equipment and kicked us out of the room and had the following conversation. First paramedic, do you know whose house this is? Second paramedic, no, whose house is it? First paramedic, it's Margaret Atwood's house. Second paramedic, Margaret Atwood, is she still alive? What is the moral? The moral is that anybody who studied in high school is dead. So by definition. And I'll also tell you about my favorite literary prize. My favorite literary prize was the Swedish Humor Award. You didn't know there was one, did you? Neither did I. So I won the Swedish Humor Award. I couldn't go and pick up the Swedish Humor Award, so my Swedish publishers went, and it took place in an amphitheater that was open to the sky. It was raining. The Swedish Humor Award was a large cut glass crystal bowl, which they collected, and it then got stolen. So I have won the Swedish Humor Award, but I don't actually have the Swedish Humor Award. Maybe that was part of the Swedish humor. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you this evening. It's a pleasure to be here where there's flowers in bloom, and not in that cold place to the north that just had an ice storm. But you're welcome. Anytime you may feel obliged to slip across the border. Not yet, not yet, not yet. No, if it were that time yet, I wouldn't be here. They wouldn't let me in, or else I'd be in jail. I will be talking more or less about identities. How do you know who I am? How do I know who you are, especially in the internet age where everyone is a cat, or else a Russian bot? How do we know who we are, specifically in novels, and more specifically in my novel, The Handmaid's Tale? But of course, all of these things have to do with real life, for how can we understand or begin to think we understand any work of art except in relation to a real world that we have experienced and that we must believe actually exists? How do we learn about a character in a book? Through what the character says and what the character does. Those two things may be different. Through what the character thinks privately, which may be different from what the character says and does, just as it is in real life. Through what other people say to the character and say about the character. Through the character's age, where they grew up, their family background, how they speak, how rich, tall, short, or poor they are, how their gender and skin color affect how they think about themselves and how other people treat them, what they are allowed to do and what they are prohibited by law or custom from doing because of who or what they are, what they fear, what they love, what music they listen to, what they read, what they smoke, inject, or drink. If you're an addict, that addiction is part of your identity. Any identifying scars, as they say in police procedurals? Any birthmarks? Any limps? Blind Pew is called Blind Pew in Treasure Island for a reason. His disability is also an ability, albeit a sinister one. Whether or not the character has an illness, a condition, a post-traumatic stress disorder, whether the character is in mourning for someone who has died. We are what we have, but we are also who we have lost. Whether the character is a psychopath. What they look like and what they wear, either by choice, fashion, by necessity, second-hand shop, or by compulsion, prison or other uniform. Whether the character is secretly a snake, a mermaid, a vampire, an alien, a werewolf, or Hannibal the Cannibal. I didn't put in zombie because you can't be a secret zombie. If you are a zombie, everyone knows it. They can see you shambling witlessly, and also you don't have much of an identity because you don't have much of a brain. Oh, and your name. Is it your birth name, your nickname, your married name? Do you have a secret name or two names? Is your name an assumed name? When the narrator of Moby Dick says, "Call me Ishmael," we know his name isn't Ishmael. So why does he want to be called that? Are you a spy using a cover identity? Are you an author using a nom de plume? Are you a con artist pretending to be someone you are not for purposes of tax evasion or personal gain? Are you a stripper or a porn star, or even just a magician or an ordinary actor with a stage name that is sexier than your given name? Rip Torn really was Rip Torn. And Victor Mature really was Victor Mature. But Rock Hudson was Leroy Scherer, and Marilyn Monroe was not Marilyn Monroe. As she famously said, if you're nobody, you can't be somebody unless you're somebody else. She was actually quite smart, you know. Which brings us to The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's name changes work in reverse to Marilyn's. The names given to them don't confer a more desirable identity. They attempt to erase the real identity these women previously had. That was the purpose of the numbers used in concentration camps. It was also the purpose when slaves had their original names taken away from them and replaced by the slavers' names in the antebellum American South. In The Handmaid's Tale, the new names, composed of the man's first name and the prefix of, are versions of the patronymics common in Europe for many centuries. Anderson meant son of Anders. Van Helsing in Dracula means of Helsing, and the French syllable de means of, as in Mrs. de Winter of Daphne Maurier's novel Rebecca, who has a double patronymic, for Mrs. is also one of those additions to a man's name that signifies an identity that comes from another person or from a place. In the opening section of the book, we hear the newly enrolled handmaids exchanging their real names in whispers at night, forbidden knowledge. For the readers of the book, cleverly deduced that because all the names except one are heard later in the book, the missing one, June, must be the name of the narrator. This wasn't in my head at the time, but it fits. So in the television series, it is actually the readers of the book who have chosen June's real name. Part of her struggle in both the book and the series must be to remember who she was and still is, despite the kind of subjugating and brainwashing techniques used on her and the others, well-known and often used techniques intended to break down both resistance and identity at the same time. Since my rule in writing the book, also the rule of the television series, was that nothing goes into The Handmaid's Tale that did not have a precedent in real life, I've been looking back in history at some of the odder laws having to do with women. For instance, in the Code of Hammurabi, Babylonia, 1792 to 1750 BC, only aristocratic women and respectably married free women were allowed to wear veils. Slaves and prostitutes could not. The penalty for a slave woman wearing a veil, thus pretending to be someone of higher social rank, was death. Here is an interesting law from the Bible, Deuteronomy 25:11-12. If two men are fighting with each other, and the wife of one of them gets into the fight, trying to save her husband from his attacker, and does so by reaching out and grabbing his genitals, you are to cut off her hand. One wonders how often that happened. This law is put in among laws about proper weights and measures, so it is probably about fairness. What if both wives entered the fray? And both did some genital grabbing? Would that make it a fairer fight? I consulted an expert who could shed little light. But fear not, this law is not likely to turn up in The Handmaid's Tale. Many of the Gilead laws have to do with who can have babies and under what circumstances, and who gets to keep the babies. There are lots of precedents in history for that kind of reproductive control. Two other obvious features of Gilead's legal system are the laws about clothing, who can wear what, and the prohibition against reading for women. In The Handmaid's Tale, you are what you wear, or you are supposed to be what you wear. Laws about clothing are very old, as we have seen from Babylonian veils. Leviticus 19:19 prohibits the wearing of cloth composed of two different kinds of material. In Rome, only the upper-class men wore togas, and only very important people could wear imperial purple. Medieval sumptuary laws decreed who could wear what, especially when it came to fur. In Gilead, the different classes of women wear different colors, so you can immediately tell by looking at someone who they are within the society. Handmaids wear red for a couple of reasons. It's harder to run away if you're dressed in red, as German prisoners of war in Nova Scotia were in the 1940s, because red shows up very well against the snow. And in Christian iconography, blue is a Virgin Mary color, but red is a Mary Magdalene color. It may interest you to know that the designer of The Handmaid's Tale, Anne Crabtree, examined 50 different shades of red before choosing the exact one. That could be a book title. 50 Shades of Red. The shape of the outfits, including the hats, comes from nuns, with the hats performing the same function. You cannot be seen by insolent eyes, but also, like a blinkered horse, your vision is restricted. It also comes from bonnets of the 1840s. I must admit also to some inspiration from the old Dutch cleanser tins of the 1940s, which showed a woman with her face hidden by a large white bonnet and holding a stick. She was supposed to be chasing dirt, but she traumatized me as a child. Not every man in Gilead gets assigned a handmaid. They are luxury items for the elite. Harems and systems of concubinage have been typical of stratified societies, rich and powerful at the top, and the more rich and powerful, the more wives and concubines, as in that young Sunday school student who wrote that King Solomon had 700 wives and 300 porcupines. In this respect, the commanders of Gilead are fairly restrained. One handmaid at a time, and until yours fails to deliver or wears out, though you can sneak off to a gentleman's club called Jezebel's for the thrill of seeing sexually available women dressed up as now prohibited roles, such as Playboy bunnies and cheerleaders. Nor do all men have Marthas, the cooks and bottle washers, who wear green. Only the higher-ups have those. The lower orders have only econo-wives who perform all functions. To signify that multifunctionality, they wear stripes. By reading Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management from the 19th century, I learned that the maid of all work had the hardest job of all, and so it is for the econo-wives. They viewed the handmaids as entitled and spoiled, and also as no better than they should be morally, and themselves as hardworking and respectable. This is an old sort of division. In Gilead, you are not only what you wear, you are also what you read or cannot read. Knowledge is power, or at least it sometimes is, and women, most women, must have their access to power severely restricted. Knowing too much could prove dangerous, both to them and to the regime. The prohibition against women reading in Gilead comes from several sources. The most obvious one is American slavery in the pre-Civil War period, when it was illegal for slaves to read, but there are many other examples in history of who could legally read what. Translating the Bible into the vernacular could mean the death sentence in England at one time, as it did for William Tyndale in 1536. He was strangled and then burnt at the stake. The common people ought not to be allowed to read such an incendiary text, filled as it is with sex and violence. There is a reason why this book has been so popular over the millennia. But also, the text was missing a few things the church was teaching as dogma, and that would have meant a considerable financial loss to the church. The argument about whether women should be allowed higher education raged for many years. The reading of the classics, Greek and Latin literature, filled as they were with all kinds of sex, would surely corrupt them. Also, wouldn't such demanding intellectual work cause women's brains to swell up and their sexual organs to shrivel? There was a prolonged 18th and 19th century argument against the reading of novels, so bad for you, especially if you were female and therefore de facto weak in the head. At this time, too, women were not allowed into art schools because they would have to do life drawing and see naked bodies, especially horrors, naked bodies of women. But women could do landscape painting and watercolors and still lifes, flowers in a vase, fruit in a bowl, These kinds of pictures were also favored as non-degenerate art by Adolf Hitler, who also liked pictures of mountains, healthy-looking farmers, and heroic soldiers. And dogs. Dogs were good. Just not naked bodies, or not too naked, maybe with bathing suits on. Gilead has a lot of pictures of flowers and fruit. Totalitarian regimes try to control access to information as one would. One detail in the television series you may not have picked up is that all the pictures on the wall in the commander's house are from the Boston Museum of Fine Art. In other words, the museum got looted, and the artists' names on these pictures are the only bits of writing that are in public view. Wow, I said when I learned this. Impressive. Did the museum lend them? Oh no, was the answer. A nice man in China painted them for us at $20 a piece. Gilead has a total prohibition on reading by most women. Even the family Bible is locked up, lest prying female eyes get into it. Of course, if you can't consult an original text, you also can't tell if that text has been altered. The Gilead regime alters the biblical text and other texts as it sees fit and for its own purposes. So the meek are still blessed, but they no longer inherit the earth. And Marx's "from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs" becomes "from each according to her abilities to each according to his needs." In the new rendering, one gender is giving, the other is being given to. A convenient arrangement, would you not say? It certainly would underline your identity as a woman, the identity you were supposed to believe was yours. And so very retro, do you not believe? Just for fun, I'm going to read you part of an article from an American magazine, Housekeeping Monthly, May 1955. It is called The Good Wife's Guide. Have dinner ready. Plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. This is a way of letting him know that you have been thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Most men are hungry when they come home, and the prospect of a good meal, especially his favorite dish, is part of the warm welcome needed. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest till you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup. Put a ribbon in your hair and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work-weary people. Be a little gay. Just a little. Be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. His boring day may need a lift, and one of your duties is to provide it. Clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives. Gather up school books, toys, paper, etc., and then run a dust cloth over the tables. Over the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he has reached a haven of rest and order, and it will give you a lift too. After all, catering for his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. Prepare the children. Take a few minutes to wash the children's hands and faces if they are small, comb their hair, and if necessary, change their clothes. They are little treasures, and he would like to see them playing the part. Minimize all noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate all noise of the washer, dryer, or vacuum. Try to encourage the children to be quiet. Greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Make the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure and his very real need to be at home and relax. Your goal: try to make sure your home is a place of peace, order, and tranquility where your husband can renew himself in body and spirit. Don't greet him with complaints and problems. Don't complain if he's late home for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through that day. Make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair or have him lie down in the bedroom. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him, arrange his pillow, and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house, and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. The women's magazines of the 1950s were full of this kind of advice. They were part of the 1950s pushback against the newly independent working women who had held down men's jobs in World War II, but now were expected to go back into the home and find fulfillment in household appliances in order to make room for men returning from the war. Move over, Jill. Jack's back. Reading this kind of advice now, we see it as a kind of brainwashing, but lifestyle advice of past periods usually does come across like that. It's a time capsule, not of how people actually lived, but of how those in charge hoped they might be persuaded to live. Women who believed this advice and who really tried to follow it might go a little crazy. No human being can repeat this flawlessly subservient pattern day in and day out. And of course, every time you didn't live up to this ideal of what your identity should be, you'd feel more like a failure and have more self-doubts. And many women did. This is the background for Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. But think of the 1950s positively. There was less emphasis on thinness and hipness and youthfulness and gorgeousness, and less expectation that you had to be a superwoman, a perfect wife and mother, plus a superachiever at your job. All you had to do was create a haven of rest, and so forth. And divorce was a lot harder, by the way. And there was no social media. We are told by the new website, Chairman Mom, that 75% of working mothers experience mom shaming through social media, total strangers insulting them for their supposed deficiencies as mothers. At least in the 1950s, the only people likely to mom shame you were your own family members. What is an identity? I gave you a list of some of the possible coordinates at the beginning of this talk, but I left out a few things. Food, for instance. Are you what you eat? Possessions. Are you what you own? Are you your memories? What about loyalty, honor, truthfulness, ethics, and courage? How much would you risk to save an innocent person pursued by an oppressive regime? How far would you go to hide a forbidden text? Who would you betray to save your own skin? What would you do to preserve democracy? I hope you will not ever be forced to learn those answers. The Handmaid's Tale was inspired by many things, but one of them I've rarely mentioned is personal stories told to me by people who worked in resistance movements or escaped from occupied countries in World War II. One of them, who had worked as a young woman in the French resistance, said, "Pray that you will never have the occasion to be a hero." I will leave you with the 4 words that end The Handmaid's Tale. Are there any questions?
So the question and answer portion of the program will be a combination of questions prepared in advance and questions from audience members. Margaret Atwood graciously suggested that the bulk of our time tonight be question and answer, but clearly we will not be able to get to all of your questions, so we want to thank you in advance for understanding. We have 6 staff members with microphones going into the audience, and the first question will come from Dr. Elizabeth Bugaigas.
First, let me thank you again for coming to Northampton Community College tonight. Just to let our audience know, we're also going to start with a question from the stage, but then we're going to go all the way to the back and work our way forward because the people in the back never get to go first. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, what is the question you're tired of hearing? We won't ask you that, but you can tell us what it is.
Actually, I'm not really tired of hearing any questions because I get to make up different answers to them. But I can tell you my favorite question of all time. It was, in Arnprior, Ontario, 1972, "Is your hair really like that, or do you get it done?"
I could say people ask me the same thing.
Yeah, so what do you say? I said, if I got it done, would I do this? But it was the age. We had just had Twiggy, which was a nightmare in the late 60s. You were supposed to have really straight hair. People ironed their hair. I didn't actually iron mine, but I did straighten it, and that was not a good thing to have done. No, it broke off. And then it grew in curly at the bottom and straight on the top. We weren't ready for that look yet. But right after that, we had the ethnic look. And when it was the ethnic look, I was fine. I was okay with it.
I understand as a curly-headed girl. So I want to first ask you a question from one of the students in Ken Burak's philosophy class. And the question is, does fictional literature play a role in helping a society change?
Okay, studies have been done. And what they say is that reading complex novels, I mean just not chase novels and novels that are all action, but novels that contain character and inner life of the characters, they actually do increase the ability to feel empathy. So reading about other people can expand your ability to empathize with other people. Say the studies. I'm sticking with that because it's a good excuse for doing what I do. It makes me sound like a good person.
All right, and now we're going to go to my colleague John, who hopefully has a question for us from all the way from the back. John, you ready?
Does
He's really all the way at the back.
He is.
Thank you. Right after the election, the 2017 election, I was at the Women's March and I saw a sign that said, "Make Margaret Atwood fiction again." It was one of my favorite signs, and my question is, do you have any words of hopefulness given our current political climate?
Okay, so given our current political climate, do I have any words of hopefulness? Of course, because if things were really bad, none of us would be here. This whole event would be prohibited. And things really are that bad in some other countries in the world. So I'm hopeful that people in America are still dedicated to the idea of living in a democracy, and that they will push back against any attempts to destroy that. That is, you're all supposed to wildly cheer. And what would that include? It would certainly include respect for human rights and some understanding of what free speech is supposed to mean, and some respect for truthfulness in journalism. Yeah. I would recommend a book that's about to be published. It's by Timothy Snyder, who wrote that little point of sale book that you may have seen called On Tyranny. And this forthcoming book is called The Road to Unfreedom. And it goes into how attempts were being made and still are being made to destroy accurate information. Because if people don't know whether what they're being told is the truth or not, it's not that they start believing lies, it's that they stop believing anything. Okay? So I would recommend that book. It deals with Russia, Europe, and the United States. It's pretty scary, but the fact that he wrote it is a sign of hope. You know, the fact that these kinds of things appear, the fact that The Handmaid's Tale is allowed to be on television is a sign of hope. So it ain't over.
I read a reflection that you wrote about George Orwell and how captivated you were at an early age with Animal Farm in the 1984, and that The Handmaid's Tale was the world according to Julia. And I was wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit more about those connections.
Okay, so I'll place myself in time, born in 1939, and therefore read Animal Farm as a child reader and thought it was going to be like The Wind in the Willows. You know, I thought jolly romp with fun animals. And of course I had no idea that it was a satire on the Soviet system, and it completely destroyed me, especially that horse. You know, that horse just ruined me. I read the part about the horse over Australian radio a few years ago and made everyone cry. It's heartbreaking. Yeah, so then I was of an age to read 1984, just when it came out. It was the era when you could buy paperbacks in drugstores. It was that first big paperback wave. And they always had lurid covers on them. So they always had a lot of cleavage on the classics. You know, you'd pick up this lurid book and find you're reading Hemingway or Faulkner. And it was a way of getting people to read books, I guess. Anyway, my 1984 has a very, I still have it. It has this most amazing cover on it. But I read it at that age, and I think I read a lot of sci-fi in the 50s when it was appearing. So John Wyndham and Ray Bradbury, too, those sorts of books and I always wanted to write one. But most of them, in fact, had male protagonists at that time. We hadn't yet gone back to excavating things like Herland, but even when we did go back, there weren't very many of them, like one. So a future world narrated by a woman seemed to me an interesting kind of thing to do. So I did it.
All right, so we're going to stay at the back of the house, and my colleague Christine, I think, will have someone with a question.
Christine, where are you?
Yeah, I think we have one back here.
Sure. We're going to give you a workout.
Hi, my name is Tom, and I'm here with my granddaughter, Giovanna. She's 11. She's right here. Wave. And she is a little shy to ask you the question directly, but she would like to know which of your books would you recommend that she read first and why?
At the age of 11.
Yes, thank you.
Probably Cat's Eye. So Cat's Eye is about the sometimes unpleasant behavior of little girls towards one another who went to public school. Who remembers being 9? Okay, so that's probably the one, maybe, might be good. Leave the others for a while. In fact, possibly even leave that one for a while, because maybe Harry Potter would be a good thing. Yeah, I don't actually write for, I write for quite young children, and then people that I like to think of as grown-ups. But I've never done chapter books for the intermediate range, though I read them.
Good. Earlier this evening, you had a chance to meet one of my former colleagues, Rachel Frick-Cardet, and she had a question for you that she hasn't asked, and that's that a love of horror definitely shows up in your work, and she's heard that you loved cemeteries as a child.
I didn't exactly love them, but I hung out in them.
What is the source of your fascination with horror?
Okay, once upon a time we had a library in our school, and the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe were in it. I don't know who did that. This wasn't high school, it was earlier than that. But I think the general division then, people thought of as anything without sex in it was suitable for children. So I don't know whether you've read the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe, but some of them are pretty horrifying. But we also at that time read horror comics, quite a bit of them. And kids like, I mean, they're an extension of folk tales, really. A lot of folk tales are sort of proto-horror. Stephen King hadn't been invented yet, so I didn't read Stephen King, but for adolescent boys who aren't that interested in reading, he's often the gateway into reading. Stephen King is. Yes, yes. It's true. So I think it's just, it's one of those branches of literature. I then, of course, became a Victorianist. I was a student of Victorian literature, and the Victorian age is par excellence the age of the ghost story. 19th century produced both Frankenstein but also Dracula, and a lot of very good ghost story and horror story writers like M.R. James, just for instance, Algernon Blackwood, etc. So I read all of those. I just read a lot. So I think the thing to ask about those kinds of stories is, why do people like them? And I think they're a way of confronting what's underground, their way of confronting the unacknowledged fears and often the acknowledged fears that people have, and contextualizing them. That's part of it, but part of it is also that a lot of people, when you talk to them, have often had uncanny experiences that can't be explained in any known scientific way. So people say, do you believe in ghosts? I say, that's not the point. The point is that people have these experiences, however you want to describe, however you want to explain them. There's a book called The Third Man Syndrome, which is about people in extreme conditions, such as being lost at sea, or being lost on mountains, or the Shackleton expedition, who felt, didn't just believe, but felt that there was an extra person with them, a helpful extra person, directing them, telling them how to get out of the horrible situation that they were in. And these experiences have been described a lot. The Third Man Syndrome, John Geiger, Geiger. And similarly, people have recently deceased loved ones turn up in their lives.
All right, Patty, do you have a question ready? I see Patty moving.
First, thank you for coming. My question is about ethics in journalism and publishing in particular. So, two questions with this. What would you say is the most unethical practice in publishing at this time? And how do we as consumers of published material support a higher standard of ethics?
Okay, newspaper publishing, book publishing, or online kinds of things.
I guess to narrow it down, I would say fiction and nonfiction books in particular.
Okay, so if it's a book and it's a reputable publisher, they will check it for libel, slander, inaccuracy, lies, and that kind of thing. Anybody who's published a book has had it fact-checked, and you work with a line editor, and they will question your facts, even like this. In Oryx and Crake, which is a work of fiction that takes place in the future, so it's not a question of libeling or slandering anybody, because nobody exists. Jimmy the Snowman sets out on an expedition, and he's got he's got 5 jolt bars with him. And my line editor said to me, so he eats one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. So you either have to give him one more or have him eat one fewer. Because people will count. And they do count. And if you make a factual error like that, you're going to hear about it. Usually, you used to get a letter beginning, "You idiot." But now you're likely to get some online insult beginning, "You idiot." So people paying attention to their own books are aware of that. Okay, I think the most unethical things that happen are probably online things. I just noticed a news item today in which somebody who's been making really false claims is being sued by the children of, being sued by the parents of children who were shot at Sandy Hook, because the person being sued maintained that the whole thing was fake. It never happened. I mean, imagine being a parent in that position. So some of what goes on online is not only false, it's cruel. It's really, but because these things are online, the law hasn't completely solidified around that yet, and people are prone to saying things online that they wouldn't say in a newspaper, for instance. Partly because newspapers stay in one place and you can sue them. Whereas people who lie a lot, or Russian bots, just change the name of the website, it vanishes and something else appears. Hasn't settled out yet.
I have a question about writing. Are writers born or made?
Are writers born or made? Okay, the best book I can recommend on that subject is called The Gift, and it's by Lewis Hyde. And the original subtitle was Imagination and the Erotic Life of Property. And The Gift isn't about how to write, and it's not about any particular methods or anything like that. It's about the fact that there's two ways of exchanging things in our society. One is buying and selling, and that's what we're used to. So I want to buy a motor car from you. I get the car, you get the money, goodbye. I need never see you again. But if you give me that car, that's a different thing. You have to be careful who you accept gifts from, especially if you're a politician, because obligation is inferred. So he says that artistic gifts are gifts. You are given a gift in some way. Let's say you inherit it, or let's say you're given the gift by previous artists in your discipline. So musicians are given a gift by other musicians that came before them. So you have the gift, but then you have to labor with the gift. You have to put in the apprentice work. You actually have to do the work of the gift. And if you do the work of the gift sufficiently, that allows you to create another gift, which is your work, which then goes out into the world and becomes a gift for somebody else. And that is how artistic succession takes place. So obviously I would not be a writer unless a lot of other writers had gone before me, and unless somebody originally had figured out how to write. So you're standing on the shoulders of a whole long succession of other human beings who have done this thing that you're doing. Music goes back really far. They found bone flutes with the same scale on them that we use today, and they're over 4,000 years old.
I like that way of thinking of it as a line, as gifts from the past and a line of succession.
Yes, passed down, passed along. So that's what they're talking about when they say, did you have a mentor, etc., and so forth. Nobody used to talk that way when I was young, but they do now, and that's what they mean.
Okay, I'm going to look to Mia for a question, and then I'm going to come over to Caroline after that. Mia?
Hi, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure. You've spoken about the challenges that women faced in the 1950s and, of course, in The Handmaid's Tale. And now we're faced with the idea of the perfect woman. How is that a challenge and a privilege, and how is that reflected in literature?
Okay, there is no perfect woman. You can relax. A lot of what you see in magazines is makeup, lights, and camera angle, and filler. So there are images of perfection, but they're just images. And I once took part in a project called Women of Canada. It was two guys. It was a makeup artist and a photographer, and they took a picture of you the way you really looked. And then they did you up like a 1940s movie star. So the images were black and white, and I can tell you that the makeup they put on 1940s movie stars was orange because it came out as a really nice shade of gray. But if you'd gone out in the street in it, they would have thought it was Halloween. It was very weird looking. So they made glamour pictures of just ordinary women of some achievement, but they weren't models or anything. And you can make a glamour picture of just about anybody. So that's what it is. And by the way, the reason models are so screamingly thin is that you always photograph wider than you actually are. I'm just telling you.
Caroline, do you have a question for us?
People watch too much Facebook anyway. They get the idea that everybody else is always having a party. But that's not true either.
Could you share with us your process of writing? For example, I know some writers write on a computer, others use a notepad. Some, from inception to the final copy.
Okay.
What is your process?
My process has always been quite disorganized. So I never learned to type properly. I never learned to touch type. I took the wrong thing in high school. What can I tell you? I didn't know I was going to be a writer. And I was scared of the people in secretarial sciences because they had very thin eyebrows. They smoked in the washroom, and when I went into high school, I was 12. They shouldn't have done that. Anyway, so I took home economics. So if you want me to set in your zipper, I can do that. But I didn't learn to touch type, and by the time I realized that I ought to have taken typing, it was too late. So I start in handwriting, I think probably because there's a brain-eye-hand coordination that's built in for people who didn't learn to touch type. So I do that. And then I transcribe. And I used to transcribe on a typewriter and make a lot of mistakes. This is before computers. And I used to have the little white brush thing. And then I also had the little tape that you could type on and stick that on. And then I had a professional typist who would take this mess that I had created and make it look like a real piece of typing. But then they invented just for me the personal computer. And when those things first came along, they had helpful creatures on them. I guess that was about the third iteration. The first one was the little window, the floppy disks that got stuck. You had to get them out with a hairpin. I think that the first thing I did that way was 1991. But then they made them bigger and they improved the programs, and they had this little box with legs that would jump around. Is anybody old enough to remember that? It would twirl about, and it would say things like, "You seem to be trying to write a letter." "How may I help you?" I actually appreciated that. And I liked it that there was somebody taking an interest. There was also this thing called Bob the Paperclip. I never got Bob the Paperclip, but I've heard stories about it. Yeah, people didn't like that one nearly so much. They felt that some voyeur was looking at them in their window, some sort of goggly-eyed weirdo. Anyway, so then they invented the red squiggly line and the green squiggly line. And I appreciate those up to a point. But I still do final editing on paper, because you can see much better, you can use a ruler, and you notice things that you don't notice on screen. So how many versions? For me, at least 6. Some writers I know feel that they can't go on to page 2 unless they've perfected page 1. I'm not that person. I like to try to get through the first draft and then go back and read it and see if it interests me. But I will be transcribing into type at the same time I'm continuing to write. And if I get going fast enough, I can write right on the keyboard. So it's that kind of thing. You used to have to actually cut and paste with scissors and Scotch tape. That's why it says cut and paste. So some of those earlier manuscripts will actually have blocks cut out and stuck onto other pages and arrows pointing here and there. So it can get quite chaotic. And another problem is that I cannot sometimes read my own handwriting. That can be a problem, but it can lead to further creativity.
It's very good for our students in the audience to hear that you don't get it right the first time.
You know, nobody gets it right the first time. Even Jack Kerouac, who was supposed to be this, roll-it-out writer, he revised. So revision is called revision for a reason. It's revision. You're seeing it anew.
So believe your professors when they say you need to do multiple drafts.
Oh, I see. This was a setup. Okay.
Well, we do like to think of this as an educational event. Earlier in your comments, you read a passage from a magazine from the 50s which gave an idealized construction of the housewife. And I was thinking that you write about the future. You also write about childhood. And I'd like to ask you about the construction of childhood, because in some of your novels, even though the children live in different times than I grew up, I recognize the way that they spent their time, unstructured, unsupervised, in a way that's different perhaps than many children grow up today with a very structured environment, a very structured, different childhood. And I'm wondering, do you think that the future will be different because we've altered childhood so much?
It's a work in progress. So coming back is the idea that you need to leave your children some unstructured time. And that if you don't, and you're hovering over them all the time, they don't have room to develop their own imaginations and so forth. And we also went through a period when people were giving their quite young children, like 2-year-olds, technology to play with. That thinking is being revised. Now people are saying, don't let them into that world too early, especially not into social media. It can be very destructive. So these things are always, every time a new technology hits, people get hypnotized by it. They just rivet themselves to it. It's one of my theories that if radio hadn't been new in the 1930s, Hitler never would have got where he got, because his big thing was radio. And at that time, people thought that anything coming out of that radio was like the voice of God. Then we got used to it, of course. And then we were riveted to television. Who's old enough to remember TV dinners? TV dinners, the TV tray in front of the TV, and everybody just glued to it. So I think the internet had that hypnotizing effect for a while, and so did the idea of ebooks. But we seem to have gone through the valley of the shadow of the ebook, and we've come out the other side. It's useful to have a digital text when you're editing because they're very easy to search. So if you think you've used the word prestidigitation earlier in your 550-page manuscript, you can find it a lot more easily with a digital search. But I think people find out what the proper uses of things are after a while. You see how hopeful I am.
I've heard there are teenagers that are actually turning off their phone for a week.
I've heard there are people who are turning off their phone for a week. I've heard there are people who are going out of the range of the internet. In fact, I do it myself once in a while. And you would be surprised how easy that is to do once you've sort of unhooked yourself from the horrid fascination.
All right, I'm going to look to my colleague Gina.
Do you ever feel like there's only so many dystopian fiction novels that have been written and that they've already been written by you and authors like you? I'm interested to see what you feel about how the genre can evolve in the 21st century.
Okay, dystopian novels come and go. In the 19th century, it was all utopias. It was all worlds that were better than the one that people felt they were living in. And the reason for that was that the 19th century had made all of these amazing advances and discoveries. Choo-choo trains, you know, sky was the limit. Germs.
Enough said.
Enough said, yeah, and many others. So they felt that kind of improvement was just going to go on, and that's when the theory of evolution got interpreted as sort of infinite progress, although not by everybody. Incidentally, Charles Kingsley already had a version in The Water Babies in which things had gone backwards. So dystopias started appearing before the First World War. There are a couple of them. Noteworthily, Jack London. But they really got going after the First World War because the myth of infinite progress had been destroyed. And after the Second World War, similarly, it was very hard to write an unself-conscious utopian vision. You could put them on other planets, but it was very hard to put them on ours at that time. I think they're starting to come back a bit. I think that visions of how to improve things, usually based on green energy, are starting to make a reappearance. But I think the dystopias are coming from young people's fear of the, I won't call it chaos, but lack of a stable world. Does that describe it? Yeah, a feeling that things are wobbling. You know, that the ground is shifting under everybody's feet, and they can't predict. They can't base actions on a firm foundation. Oh, how can I put this? So I think that's where they're coming from, but the genre is by no means exhausted. I've seen a lot of very interesting variations recently. in the past, say, 10 years or so. Want to hear some? Okay, try the water knife. Water knife. Or try The Power, Naomi Alderman. So Naomi Alderman does a book in which women have developed the ability to electrocute people. It's not always a good thing. I'm just telling you that right now. Remember what I said, there are no perfect women? Well, anyway, she thinks it through. Yeah, so I would say, if your question is, how about your dystopia that you're writing now, I would say go for it. Surprise us.
All right, we're going to take 2 more questions from the floor, and I'm going to ask if John has someone all the way at the back.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm from Hamilton, Ontario. So
Hamilton is a hot spot right now.
hot spot.
Yes, they're shooting some of the Handmaid's Tale there.
Yes, yeah, which is very exciting. So I just wanted to mention Cat's Eye. I know we talked briefly about it. It's 100% my favorite book of all time. I fell in love with you and your work in grade 9, as we say in Canada, not 9th grade. But it's just a piece that I absolutely love, and I brought my copy, actually a brand new copy, that I would love to pass along if you'd like to take it. So that would be great. But thank you for being here.
Very sweet. Thank you.
Okay, and then Patty, do you have someone? Last question. Make it a good one.
So I'm a really big fan of your work. My favorite piece is the Mad Adam series. So I thought it was really cool in that series how so many of the characters have survived like traumatic experiences. Toby, Zeb, Amanda, they've all gone through different sorts of like abuse and bad experiences, but they're these dynamic, active characters. I'd be interested in how you decided to explore that theme and write characters like that who are survivors and they're not just victims or on a revenge fantasy or something.
Well, they're also all in make or break situations. So they have difficult backgrounds, as a lot of people do. But then, throw somebody into the ocean. Are you going to swim or not? So they're up against it. They have to. They're faced with immediate challenges in the world that they're put into, and they have to figure those out fast. I'm not sure that's the answer to your question. Let us say that everybody in that world, except those existing inside the sort of closed techno communities. When I wrote that, we didn't even have sort of Google Campus or anything like that. But in this future world, for those who haven't read it, corporations are creating their own enclosed living, working spaces. So you're inside a corporation, or else you're out in the plebes, because the future society has given up on public space. So in a society that's given up on public space, things are very chaotic, unless you're in the equivalent of a castle with fortified walls around it. So that's why things are chaotic in their lives.
Margaret Atwood, let us again thank you for coming to our college.